Part of the reason we wanted to look at this is because children are uniquely susceptible. They are vulnerable in a way that adults aren't. They take in more air per pound than adults do. And because they're still young and developing, their organs are affected in ways that ours aren't. That means that whatever they breathe, the effects of that are magnified considerably. Some people say as much as 10 times. Now, EPA had data on this. They had a model that was designed to track industrial pollutants and to try to figure out where they go. Yet, for some reason, EPA had never used its data this way. And as a consequence, we had absolutely no idea what was out there. The other reason we didn't have any idea is because there are no laws that compel the government to do this. In fact, the only laws that compel the government to do any kind of ambient air monitoring go to the components of smog. And that leaves about 180 other chemicals that are classified as hazardous that we don't know anything about. We have no idea where they are, how much of them are there. So our approach, it was pretty simple. Our first step was to basically try to identify schools where further investigation was warranted. Now, we chose those schools for a simple reason, and we chose schools conceptually for a simple reason. They were places where children were required to gather. It wasn't just that you lived in a bad part of town. We had to send our kids there. We were given no choice. So the idea was, what's in the air outside of those schools? So that's when Brad and I began gathering the information that we would need to move forward.
The very first thing we gathered when we set out to complete this project was an EPA model known as Risk Screening Environmental Indicators. And we were very grateful to have help in that from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and some of the researchers there who had spent considerable time and, as it turns out, money obtaining from the EPA a set of those data that go beyond what the agency regularly hands out. The next step was to build a list of the nation's schools, which is harder than you might think. We got a lot from the U.S. Education Department, but we also stitched together our own list dealing with 24, I think, state education agencies, and came up with 127,800 schools, I believe, at the end of the day, private, public, and parochial around the country. From there, we were able to overlay the schools onto this model to look at the effect industrial pollution was having. This is a model that tells you how chemicals travel through the air when they leave a smokestack and where they're likely to land and in what concentration. And we wanted to be very careful in this process. The model tells you lots of things that you can draw lots of conclusions from, and only some of them will be valid. And we worked very carefully in this process with academic researchers, public health experts, and frankly, even people at the EPA to understand the limits of what we had. And what we had was a very valuable ranking tool. So what we did with that tool was to look at how many schools around the country indicated worse exposure to toxic chemicals than a school that was closed down in 2005 after state regulators in Ohio determined that the risk of contracting cancer there was 50 times higher than they determined was acceptable. And with that, we'll show you the first video of what we found.
I don't know exactly what they do down there.
Like, I never really realized, like, it can be, like, that harmful. I just thought, like, there's pollution everywhere.
I say that it smells like perm solution.
Sometimes smell like a sweeter type, bitter type smell.
We wanted to take a look at the impact of industrial pollution on schools around the country. Kids are particularly susceptible to the impact of industrial pollution, and very little is known about how toxic chemicals might affect their health. So we took EPA data and a government model, and we overlaid the locations of about 128,000 schools. It's a task that the government has never tried to do. What we found were high levels of dangerous chemicals that appeared outside a lot of schools around the country. Now, it's only a model, but the model does tell us where toxic hotspots are and which schools might be there. Meredith Hitchens Elementary School is located along the Ohio River in a town outside Cincinnati called Addyston, Ohio. And in 2005, the Ohio EPA was called in and asked to do some monitoring on the roof of the school. What they found were very high levels of toxic chemicals, so high that they said the risk of cancer there was about 50 times above what the state considered acceptable.
It was a good place to be for those kids. It had to be 70 years ago when I started. And I went from first grade to the 8th grade here.
We had a facility directly across from the school where we're sitting that had a variety of upsets and accidents in a year, 2004. When we found these high concentrations, we found they yielded unacceptable results compared to the health-based standards that the Ohio EPA uses.
As a consequence, the district decided to act fast. They got the kids out of the school, closed the school down.
That was a pipe foundry years ago before it became a chemical company. But that's all over and done with.
We now know that a lot of diseases are triggered by early exposures, but it takes years, even decades, for those diseases to progress from the early exposure to the actual manifestation of a disease like cancer.
The Ohio Department of Health confirmed that there were additional cancers in this neighborhood. It was taken very seriously and very upsetting.
Matt Becker is a teenager who lives about 2 miles from the plastics plant that's across the street from Meredith Hitchens Elementary. He was diagnosed with cancer a couple of years ago, and his parents wonder, could that have been caused by the chemicals that were being emitted by that plant?
The doctors came in, they pulled chairs in. You're wondering why all this fuss. Why are they pulling all these chairs in? Where are all these people coming from and why?
Instead of using the word tumor, they used the word mass.
So of course my mind goes to tumor, goes to cancer. I just immediately started crying.
My mom started crying right there. My dad just put his head down. And then they said non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I had a tumor that was about 8 inches by 6 inches, like this. Right there in the center of my chest, behind my chest bone. I was sitting there in my bed while they were talking, like holding it in, trying not to cry, and the tears just came out when everybody left. And I told my grandma that, like I don't want to die.
I thank God every day that he's in remission. With the economy today, we can't move. Our house won't sell. We won't have anywhere to go.
On a human level, you got to say, well, I really feel for you as a parent. I'm a parent. A sick child is probably the worst nightmare for any parent. I think not knowing what the cause is probably the worst part about it. I don't know what the cause of it is either.
The plant's changed hands since the Ohio EPA started monitoring there, and the former owner said that its pollution never posed any serious health risks. The new owner says they're committed to doing even better.
We are committed to making sure that we are not a cause of any type of issue like this going forward. We're working continually to try to improve our performance. We show improving trends in all of our emission controls since we've taken over ownership, and I think that's what you look for. You look for improvement all the time.
Immediately after our legal orders against this facility, the air became cleaner, and since then has had some improvements in air quality. We're still working to secure the long-term guarantee of air quality in the area.
Part of the reason we wanted to use the EPA model is because it creates a ranking system that compares one site to another. It's also part of the reason we wanted to look at Meredith Hitchens. We knew from the 7 months of monitoring that the Ohio EPA did what was in the air outside that school. And we know from the model that when we rank that school against others, we get an accurate representation of those that are worse and those that are likely better. And what we ended up finding were about 435 schools where the air outside appeared to actually be worse than the school in Ohio that was shut down.